Hello and welcome. As part of our discussions on humanitarianism and humanitarian action discussions, today we have Professor Mukesh Kapila, who is a professor of global health at Manchester University. And Professor Kapila has been in the humanitarian world for most of his life. And we are going to discuss with him about local actors and local action in humanitarian sector. Welcome, Professor Kapila.
Thank you, James. I'm delighted to be here at the International Center for Humanitarian Affairs in Nairobi, and also to be associated with you as your adjunct professor. I'm now a professor of global health and humanitarian affairs at Manchester University in the UK. My real career started after I qualified, and I wanted to widen my horizons from medicine. So I went on to do public health, and then spent the last 20 years in humanitarian roles in various organizations, in the British government, in DFID as the head of humanitarian affairs, then at the UN and at the Red Cross, where I was Under Secretary General in Geneva. So I combined both a health background and a humanitarian background, and the two coming together, I think, has been basically the driving force of my career.
Okay, good. Mukesh, tell us, maybe we can take a view of the history of humanitarianism, and we just take this discussion from there, try to understand it a little bit, from history and tradition.
The humanitarian instinct, the desire to help someone else in distress, is as old as humanity itself. So it's intrinsic in us as human beings. And if you go back thousands of years, millennia, you will see that deep in history and in every language and in every culture, there are humanitarian traditions. So for example, in Mongolia, Genghis Khan started off what we now call international humanitarian law. And in many epochs of history, we find that many local leaders and religions started off a framework for humanitarian protection and action in their own particular context. Historically, there are two drivers of the way humanitarianism has evolved. Firstly, it's globalization. As people started exploring the world around them and moving out of their own locations, they recognized the importance of cooperating with others. And that actually meant that you had to relate to others in a human manner, in a cooperative manner. And that gave us principles such as humanity and universality. And then the other great driver, unfortunately, has been conflict. So, and the human history is riddled with conflict. But as conflict makers, generals, soldiers, recognized that in order to wage war successfully, they also had to become humanitarians, because there was a need to protect those who were not involved in the conflict, whether they're ex-combatants or whether they are civilians. So those two drivers ultimately culminated in the Battle of Solferino, where Henry Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross, in a sense came to the same logic and created what we know as the modern humanitarian movement, exemplified by the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement.
Yeah. Now, apart from the Red Cross, who are some of the other major players? There's been people that have advanced the thinking that humanitarianism is, or humanitarian action is an extension of sovereignty of the state.
As states formed, the social contract that leads to justification of a state is really how a state deals with its citizens. That's the social compact between the citizen and the state. And therefore, what we call humanitarian values nowadays are fundamental in terms of mediating that particular relationship. But when states came into conflict with other states, then of course the question of sovereignty came up. And what we've seen all through recent history is this conflict or clash between absolute sovereignty, in other words, the right of a state to do what it's like in its own boundaries and in relation to its own citizens, and a greater sovereignty, which is about the sovereignty and supremacy of the human race. And that conflict or clash has in various times in history led to both cooperation among states, the creation of the African Union, the creation of the European Union, and so on, and at the same time also created a lot of mistrust among nations because humanitarian problems, if they are seen to be the excuse for one nation interfering in the affairs of another nation, leads actually to a lot of misunderstanding.
Yes. Now, lately there have been figures that have been put out, or statistics put out, that in the humanitarian sector, the budgets have grown by 14 times in the last 10 to 15 years. And these budgets are largely controlled by international NGOs or international organizations. For the local actors, who control 1.6% of the budgets, and oftentimes are the first responders, and they are the responders that are left with the problem after the disaster, rehabilitation and reconstruction. I mean, what does that say, or if anything, about the system?
Well, I think the system has become, the humanitarian system, as it is evolving now, has become an end to itself and seems to have forgotten what its purpose was when it was created. When the international humanitarian system got going, and modern history on that starts really with the end of the Second World War, the idea of showing solidarity across boundaries to people who have suffered misfortune in other countries was a good one. And that led to the creation of international humanitarian organizations of various sorts, both as NGOs and in the UN system. But as the organizations expanded and as the world globalized, then those who were running those organizations switched from an ethos of serving the people to an ethos of serving their own organization. And the logic of that corporatization of humanitarian action meant that preserving the space for the organization, or expanding its space, or its market share, became more of a driver than that of serving. Now, in that kind of logic, the role of the local actor, who is closest to the needs on the ground, the needs and suffering on the ground, often gets masked. And there is also another factor in that. There is a lack of understanding about the resilience and courage of the people on the ground. The dominant paradigm is that people have suffered a misfortune, they've had a crisis, they've had a disaster, they are helpless, and we have to come in from outside to help them. And that has become the sort of culture of the way international organizations and the international humanitarian system operates. It's like a default model. You see. But in the same period of time, the last 40, 50 years, a lot of capacities have grown up on the ground. Yeah, education has improved, people have become more conscious of the world with the flow of information and communication modalities, and more people want to be able to assert their own solutions to their own problems. But I'm afraid the international actors are way behind in terms of recognizing that. And then, unfortunately, the logic of the international system is, and international organizations, is that it's not in their interest to actually give their space to local actors. So we have a paradox. And the paradox is that on one hand, we all agree that humanitarian action is most effective when it is closest to the people and done by people closest to the ground. But at the same time, the business logic is exactly the opposite.
Yeah. So what, if someone were to say what international actors are there, they're working in many local areas, and some of them have metamorphosed into country-specific organizations. You know, in your view, what would constitute local action?
In my view, a genuinely local actor should meet a number of criteria. One, it must come from the community. The community can be defined in many ways. A community can be a whole nation, a community can be a region, a community can be a village, depending on the scope of action. But whatever it is, it must come from genuinely from there. Secondly, it should be informed by local culture, local perspectives, and local dynamics. Thirdly, a genuinely community actor will be connected with the ordinary people on the ground. Because remember that in the end, nobody can come from outside to change a person's life. It has to emerge from within. Fourthly, genuine community action or local action, genuine local action, has to first identify and mobilize and deploy local capacities first. Once all that has been done, then the local actor is well prepared to be able to receive international or outside assistance, which is therefore in synergy with and brings added value to the local action.
The local CBOs and NGOs may not be too aware of humanitarian principles. They may not adhere to them. They may be easily compromised, as opposed to international organizations. You know, what's your view on this?
I think we are all compromised. Whether we are local, national, or international, we have to be humble enough to recognize that we are organized within our own set of paradigms, our own. So, for example, an international actor is not necessarily automatically more neutral, because that international actor will be reliant on some sources of funding. They will be reliant on the policies of the donors. They will be reliant on some historic relationship between the donor community or the donor nation and the recipient community or recipient nation. So already you are coming with a set of preconceived ideas, some prejudices, some notions. And you also have obligations to whoever is funding you. And the funder may impose upon you certain demands on how you do business or who you serve and so on. So an international actor is not necessarily automatically a neutral or impartial actor. Similarly, a local actor will no doubt be influenced by situation on the ground, which could be political, it could be economic, it could be cultural and social. But that's the reality. So I feel that the fact that local actors or international actors may be biased in some way based on their own particular realities is not necessarily a wrong thing. That's the reality. The important thing is to acknowledge that reality and to be able to be transparent about it. Once everyone understands where the other person is coming from, then there can be mutual respect for each other's prejudices and each other's biases. But if we postulate that I am more neutral than you, or you are more impartial than me, then I think we're immediately set up into a situation of mistrust. You know, and fundamentally, at the root of all this is the issue of trust, and between outsiders and insiders, locals and outsiders. And how to build the trust relies first on understanding each other's realities.
Very good. Now, as we come to an end, what are some of the conditions that you see as important that must take place in order for the shift in the paradigm? If we are to agree that the local action is vitally important to effective response. But then they only control 1.6% of the budget. What are some of the set of conditions that we would have to move towards in order for us to start to reverse this trend?
Well, the theoretical answer is that local capacities need to be built up. But it's easier to say this than to do it. If local capacity building was the problem and the solution, then I think we would have seen much better progress with it over the past decades. So undoubtedly, local capabilities, knowledge, training, and so on all have their role to play. But in my view, they miss a vital point, and that is the issue of power relationships. See, the reason why, although we acknowledge the importance of local agency, the value of local action for effectiveness, we appear to be reluctant to actually turn that into practice because we are reluctant to give up our own position in the national or international system. Yeah? And it's this transference of power and the willingness to take the risks that go with it that need to happen. Undoubtedly, handing over things, responsibility, power, money, authority, carries with it a risk. What if local people misuse this? What if they're not capable? What if they're illiterate, uneducated, inefficient? And all of us think we're better than them anyway. Yeah. Making that leap of trust and being willing to make mistakes along the way and let them make the mistakes along the way is an important part of growth, if you like. If we don't do that, then all we're going to do is to consolidate the status quo. And the status quo is more and more disempowering people on the ground. Now, how we actually transfer this power, which is it's not a technical issue. This is not an issue of regulation or bureaucratic mechanisms or new procedures. It is an issue of the social contract between all levels of society. Of course, governments have a very important role to play in this. The national governments, if national governments don't stand up to international actors and sell their sovereignty down the road when it comes to having the space to act as they want, act properly in their own country, then clearly those who are at the bottom of the pile, the local communities, they don't stand a chance, you see. But the problem very often with our governments is that national governments, especially if they're weak, have been co-opted into the international project, because there is a nexus of patronage between the international system and the elites of the national system. See? And therefore there is this hypocritical game being played where governments proclaim sovereignty, but actually they are giving up that sovereignty, or they are compromising that sovereignty and not genuinely democratizing their authority within their countries. So really this is strategy at two levels. One is about genuine democracy at country level. Democracy is not about elections. Democracy is about a mindset. Democracy is about respect in a country. It doesn't matter how you vote or what kind of parliament you have. It is about the values that say that listening to the opinions of others and caring for others is important to me. So that's the national side of it. And then on the international side, we need a reform of the international system whereby we move the international system to greater accountability. The way the international system currently operates, whether it is in the United Nations or whether it is large federal organizations in the private sector or in the NGO sector, is that they become self-serving to their own self-elected elite. When you are a large organization with billions of dollars of budget, where is your accountability towards? Your accountability is to your own executive, your own governing board, or your own management system. But who elected that management system? You know, it is basically themselves. You know, they advertise for a chief executive. The chief executive comes into position, so he's accountable to the board. Who appoints the board? This old board members. See, so there is a self-perpetuating system. See, and therefore, public accountability, which is what we should be aiming for, is gone. See, they're not even accountable to the beneficiaries. A lot is said about accountability to beneficiaries. In practical terms, because of the asymmetry of information and power, this is just empty rhetoric. So we need a revolution in terms of the accountability of the international system, and we need a deepening of the social compact between national governments and their citizens to be able to bring about a transformation in the relationships between national and local actors. I think it's important not to misunderstand what I'm saying, in the sense that national and local actors cannot just operate as they like either. They are part of a greater world.
Yes.
And therefore, especially with globalization, where we are all interconnected in some way or the other, it is important for people to learn that yes, they have certain rights in how they wish to act locally, but they have certain obligations in relation to how their actions have an impact on others outside of that local area.
Yes.
And that ability to be able to be internationalist and localist at the same time is, I think, where we as society and as the big society of the world needs to be moving forward in a more purposeful manner.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Mukesh, as always, for your very thoughtful analysis and provocative thoughts. My name is Dr. James Kisia, Executive Director of the International Center for Humanitarian Affairs. Today, talking to Mukesh Kapila, a professor of global health at Manchester and an adjunct professor here at International Center for Humanitarian Affairs. Thank you.